All right, let's dive right into this explainer and look at the mathematical anomalies of the 2025 Polish presidential election, exactly as advanced AI territorial data presents them. Today, we're completely stripping away the political punditry, the media narratives. We're looking purely at the numbers. We're going to take raw source documents, specifically a comprehensive statistical audit of the 2025 election, and walk through the data exactly as the forensic model sees it. By treating the raw CSV territorial data as evidence in a forensic audit, we're going to explore a really fascinating statistical mystery here, without taking any political sides. Think of it like this. Human behavior, when you aggregate it over millions of interactions, actually tends to leave highly predictable mathematical fingerprints. When an election happens, data scientists can look at the flow of voters, the distribution of ballots, and even the correlation of errors across thousands of municipalities. If something disrupts that natural flow, well, the math highlights it immediately as a red flag or an anomaly. And that is exactly what our source material attempts to uncover today. So here's our roadmap for the investigation. First, the forensic approach. Second, the vote shift. Third, the invalid vote anomaly. And finally, the verdict. Okay, let's kick things off with part one, the forensic approach. To really begin our investigation, we have to understand the core metric the auditors used to analyze the municipal and county data. Because, you see, when you're looking for anomalies between two rounds of an election, you can't just look at the final score. You have to look under the hood at the exact mechanics of where the new votes actually came from. So the absolute crucial point here is understanding this pool of new votes, which represents the exact cache of votes up for grabs between the two final candidates. In the source document, they call this pula nowych głosów. In a two-round election system, the second round brings in a totally new dynamic. Some folks who didn't vote in the first round suddenly show up. And more importantly, people whose preferred candidates were eliminated in the first round now have to choose between the remaining two. The combination of these two groups creates this distinct, mathematically measurable pool. So the source of growth for both candidates is essentially locked into this newly formed pool of voters in the second round. Think of it like a finite bucket of available votes. The sum of the vote increases for both candidates creates this distinct cachet, which is then divided between them. To find out if an election behaved normally, statisticians measure exactly how this specific pool of voters distributed themselves across different geographic territories. Once we define this pool, we can actually compare it historically. Moving right along to part two, the vote shift. Now, let's see how this builds when we compare the baseline 2020 election to the 2025 election. The 2020 election is basically going to serve as our control group. It gives us a picture of how these vote pools typically divide themselves across Polish municipalities. Looking closely at the raw municipal data extracts, we immediately see a massive expansion in the new vote pool in 2025 compared to 2020. Back in the 2020 baseline, looking at Duda and Trzaskowski, the total pool of new votes up for grabs was exactly 6,091,058. But jump to 2025, between Nawrocki and Trzaskowski, that pool swelled to an astounding 8,547,411 votes. I mean, that is an influx of over 2.4 million additional moving pieces in the second round. A larger pool means more data points, which in statistical terms usually means more predictable, stable curves. But actually, that's not what happened here. The 2025 split of that pool marks a dramatic, and I mean dramatic, departure from the 2020 baseline. Nawrocki captured an average of 64%, leaving Trzaskowski with 35%. In 2020, the average share of this new vote pool was much more evenly distributed. Duda took about 40% on average, and Trzaskowski took about 57%. But in 2025, the data shifts incredibly hard. Nawrocki captures a staggering 64% average share, and Trzaskowski's share plummets to 35%. Now, while a shift in voter preference is totally normal in politics, what the data scientists are zeroing in on is exactly how that 64 to 35 split was distributed territorially. When we map this out visually, the data forensics reveal a drastic, unexpected mathematical shift. The 2020 distribution forms relatively natural overlapping bell curves, which is exactly what you'd expect in a large data set of human behavior. But jump to the 2025 data, and the curves for Nawrocki and Trzaskowski have completely pulled apart from each other. The curves are rigid, they're distinctly separated, and honestly they behave almost like entirely different isolated populations rather than a dynamic, interacting voting base. By stacking them up and viewing these shifts together, we can clearly see that the entire pattern of how new votes were distributed fundamentally and severely changed. In 2020, those curves intersect significantly, showing a highly competitive environment across municipalities. In 2025, that intersection is practically gone. The data from the source document highlights that such a stark, uniform polarization across literally every single municipality is highly anomalous. It essentially suggests that the pool of new votes didn't flow organically, it fractured mathematically in a way that just doesn't align with the previous electoral model.
Which brings us to part 3, the invalid vote anomaly.
This is probably the most critical and complex twist in our whole territorial data investigation. We're moving away from who got the valid votes, and we're looking closely at the ballots that were thrown out. Now, invalid votes, ballots with mistakes, multiple boxes checked, or left blank, they are a normal part of literally any election. Usually they're just completely randomly distributed noise. But the AI analysis uncovered a distinct, non-random mathematical pattern regarding these thrown out votes across all levels of aggregation. Looking at how candidate vote shifts map against invalid vote shifts, we see two entirely different trend lines. For Nawrocki, there's a solid trend line pointing slightly downward, but for Trzaskowski, the trend line points distinctly upward.
The dichotomy here is crystal clear. Statistical models show a positive correlation for Trzaskowski's vote surge and invalid votes, but a negative correlation for Nawrocki's. According to the source analysis, in territories where Trzaskowski gained more votes, the number of invalid, thrown-out ballots also surged. Conversely, in territories where Nawrocki saw his biggest gains, the number of invalid ballots actually decreased. Statistically speaking, this is a huge red flag. Invalid votes should be random. They absolutely should not neatly correlate with the success or failure of specific candidates across hundreds of voting districts.
And finally, part 4, the verdict. So, what is the final conclusion drawn by the data scientists after analyzing all these ecological regressions? We've seen the massive, unprecedented shift in the distribution curves, and we've seen this highly unusual inverted correlation regarding the invalid ballots. The forensic audit basically summarizes that these tightly correlated events cannot simply be explained away as random voter behavior. And importantly, the source document notes that these correlations exist not just at some high national level, but they are statistically significant all the way down to the granular municipal and county levels. These dual phenomena indicate mathematical anomalies on a very substantial scale. In fact, the source document explicitly states that the probability of these specific mathematical events occurring randomly is close to 0%. Translating that quote directly from the audit's conclusions, this means that this is not a random situation, and the probability of such an event occurring is close to 0% at the level of municipalities and counties. Now, the data doesn't assign intent, and it certainly doesn't name a culprit. It simply states that, mathematically, the numbers presented in the 2025 election results do not behave according to the standard laws of natural statistical probability, leaving us with a really powerful question. As AI and statistical forensics become more and more advanced, is this type of data auditing going to become the ultimate impartial judge of election integrity? When human biases, political spins, and media narratives totally cloud the waters, raw CSV data and statistical modeling provide a cold, hard look at reality. Because as the 2025 Polish election audit proves, numbers always leave a trace. Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with us today, and remember to always keep questioning the data.